thank you. I'm going to invite everyone to return to their chairs. We have the rich feast today of learning about our relationship with others, and we want to invite Sunitha to come forward and continue her conversation with us so that we might be more effective as we reach out to people in our mission field who come from different cultures. And when we relate to our global companions, we want to be more effective and more self-aware about how we are with them. Let's give her a warm hand of appreciation. Thank you, Sunitha.
Thank you, everybody. We started off our session before lunch, and we talked about accompaniment. We talked about the different values of accompaniment, mutuality, inclusivity, vulnerability, empowerment, and sustainability. We talked about culture being like an iceberg, and this conversation is very crucial to us because the question before us is, the defining question in mission before us is, how do we engage the other? I left you with a story about how we understand arranged marriage from the Indian perspective, and also shared with you because we are collectivistic. Our culture is collectivistic. That's why arranged marriage isn't even possible. You know, that's also a practice that happens in India. And so, as sharing this iceberg, after I did this session in a particular place, I had a young woman who walked up to me, and she said, so was there anybody in your family that had a love marriage? And I said, yes. And she said, how progressive of you. So I just waited, and I said, actually, my sister is married in an arranged marriage. And I paused and I waited because I wanted to hear whether she would say, how backward of you. How backward of you. I'm going to be a little louder. I heard that you can't quite hear me at the back. Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Yes, good. So I was just sharing that after, my presentation like this, I had walked out and a young woman came up to me and asked me if anybody in my family chose the American way of getting married. And she said, did they have a love marriage? And I said, yes. And she said, how progressive of you. And I paused and I waited and I said, my sister got married in an arranged marriage. And I waited to hear if then the response is how backward of you. Because I think if you are from a minority culture, sometimes you hear these things so that your culture is less than and that people are waiting for you to evolve. People are waiting to evolve. And when you see these icebergs clashing, it reminds me that when we encounter otherness or diversity, the first reaction that we have isn't, yay, diversity. I'm sorry to break it to you, but that's not our first reaction. Because remember, I told you when some of the characteristics of culture are that they're patterned, they're modeled, you repeat them over and over again, and they become ingrained till they're your norm. So if I said, you drive on the right side of the road here, right? As opposed to the wrong side, come on. So when my mom was introducing me to the way that we eat in India, she didn't say, Chinna, there are so many ways to eat food, and this happens to be one of them. She didn't say that to me. You know what she said? This is how you eat. And not only that, she also told me, the food tastes so much better when your fingers touch that food, and that food with your fingers touches your mouth. It's the most beautiful way to eat. That's what my mom told me. So all of us have this experience of taking our culture as the norm, as it's being ethnocentric. You know, we go into life saying, this is the way we dress, this is the way we talk to one another, and this is the way we do life, this is the way we eat. And so when we encounter otherness, when you're taught saying, if I'm normal, then what are you? Abnormal. And so, when our impulse is to impose our cultural iceberg on others. Does anybody know what I'm talking about? Yes? Our impulse is to impose our icebergs on others. So here are some thoughts for you as you're listening to me. Know that your worldview, the way that you view the world or your cultural formation is normal to you. It is normal to you. And then here's, like, I'm not going to stand here and say, you know, here's 10 hours of cross-cultural competency training that I can share with you, and here's the binder that will fix all this. No, but I found it very helpful to catch one emotion that comes up in you. I call it flagging it. You know, the emotion that comes up in us when we encounter otherness is judgment. The first emotion that rises up in us is judgment. Flag it. Flag it. See if that can be converted into curiosity, interest, empathy, perhaps, wanting to know another story, another way of viewing life, another way of doing life. Another thing that I would like to share with you, that sometimes in my conversations about culture or worldview, I get this feeling that people think they're objective. Here's something that I'm going to let you know, if you don't know already, that none of us are objective. None of us are objective. We wear glasses, and we see things by the glasses that we wear. Yes? Yes. It's okay. It's okay, folks. We don't have to be God. We are subjective, and it's okay. And something for those of us who live in the United States to know, and I include myself here because I experience it when I go back home as someone who lives and works in the United States, is that we have power. We have power behind our values and our worldviews. And I can tell you, if Indians had power, they would make sure that all of you are considering arranged marriage. Someone said we are. I hear it a lot from women, actually. I'm trying to sign up Peter for arranged marriage here, one of the musicians. I also wanted to share that social Darwinism is still alive and active. It's alive and active, which what means is that, are you evolved enough? Are you evolved enough? Keeps ringing in the ears of people that are sometimes from minority cultures. Have you evolved enough to use a fork? Are you evolved enough to understand this language? Are you evolved enough to know dating? Are you evolved enough? And so this is pretty serious, folks. Because when I look at the world and I look at the cultures, because remember what I said, the way that culture comes into place, because it's a meaning-making metrics for us. It's a way that we find meaning and value in life. And when someone invalidates that, a whole group of people are wiped out sometimes. And when I look at different cultures, I wonder if we were meant to be mirrors onto one another. You know? I wonder if we were meant to be mirrors onto one another. So what is your worldview? A lot of times when different groups come together or difference comes together or otherness comes into the picture, we think about what can I learn about you? You know, what's all the things that I can, let me do a survey, let me do the taboos, what do you do, what don't you do? Very often we don't take a look at ourselves. We don't do some deep diving into ourselves. I'm also realizing this about a Lutheran tradition. Being contemplative is not something we're very good at. We're very good at social action. We're not that good at going inside and being contemplative about what is happening within us. And so, what is your worldview? So we're going to take some time to think about what it is that we bring to the table when we encounter another. So this is a disclaimer. I'm making gross generalizations, just because I'm trying to get some conversation started. And I am maybe trying to push your buttons a little bit. Am I pushing buttons? Maybe. Well, you won't tell me if I am. You won't tell me because you're Lutheran. So, and I understand that cultures are ever evolving. I can't like take a particular table and say this is your culture or something like that because it's so complex. But all I'm doing here is just trying to generate some conversation. So here's one thing that I wanted to lift up. Change is huge here. And change is actually a positive thing in your culture. Here's how my culture looks at change. Isn't that great? Yes. I told you that our values surface as symbols, and commercials are one way that the market is very good at doing this, right? It knows what's underneath the water to change the behavior that's at the tip of the iceberg. And so you see how cultures like India or China, for that matter, are pretty ancient, and so change is not always a positive thing. Though I understand in church conversations, you're like, oh my goodness, the church doesn't know what it means to change. But comparatively, East culture is more open to change and see it more as a positive thing than cultures that are more ancient. And so that's one example of what would be a core value of this culture. So there's a whole bunch of things in these two icebergs. Like I said, if you had two icebergs stand beside one another that were formed in different places of the world, you see individualism on one side and collectivism on the other. And I want to show you like some of the things that surface up because of these values. Freedom is a big value here. Yes? Yes. And so you hear a lot more conversation on individual rights, not much about community rights, right? And in the Indian context, you know, if I was doing a presentation there, I would say, hey, what about the individual? And over here, I see the community thrown on the bus over and over again. And so there's freedom. And then choice is huge, right? And who has choice? The individual has choice. The choice does exist in a collectivist culture, but the choice belongs to the community. And I can tell you, if you were born in the United States, it's very hard for you to wrap your mind around arranged marriage because you can't conceive of a way of doing life without choice being involved, without your choice being involved. I mean, look at the toothpaste options in our grocery stores. Very different, right? And then search for identity. Search for identity becomes a huge thing in mission. You know, my mom is in India and she serves about 300 children there. And she asked me, and there are a lot of people that come on mission trips, and then she'll ask me this question. She'll say, Chinna, what are they looking for? It's a search for identity. That's a big part of who you are. Self-reliance. Pull yourself by the See, so then you can understand values when you listen to proverbs or sayings that are in your culture. So dependency is not a bad word in my culture, actually. Being dependent on one another is actually a value. So egalitarianism is very important, but it is then tied to meritocracy, which means that things can be unequal as long as you have earned it. Right? Am I hitting some points here? And so there is, and the sense of identity in collectivist cultures are like, I am because we are. My identity is not separate from you. I know myself because I am in relationship. I am a daughter. I am an aunt. I am this. I am that. My identity is connected to community. So there's a different way that I understand my I than you do. And it's hierarchical. If you go to India, you will see hierarchy. And I think maybe that's why caste system flourishes so much, because of that. And you can see the good and bad, too, of all these values that are both sides of the coin over here. We view nature in different ways. I can't say, how we view nature. There's nothing unnatural about the natural world. It can be studied, predicted, and even manipulated and controlled. So that's one way of viewing nature. There's different ways of viewing nature. The Native Americans, I think, in their tradition, viewed nature differently. And I think there's excellent things that have come from this view of nature. I mean, diseases have been cured, things have been, that evolved around this value. But not everybody views this nature in the same way. I love this one, because if you ever interact with people from different cultures, and let me tell you, with the musicians, this is our biggest struggle, all of us being on time, right? Or those of you who have traveled into different cultures, or even with the cultures here in the United States, you notice that our perception of time, or how we view time, is also different. Whether you value time over relationships, or whether it's a waste of time to do certain things, or what is respectful and what we value over something else. And this is very interesting, because the Indians' way of viewing time is very cyclical. And so those people that are Hindu, especially in India, they have this cyclical view of life. That, you've heard of reincarnation, and so they believe that things are going in circles. So it's very different way of people viewing time. You're more open to taking risks, because there's this feeling that you can learn from your mistakes, so they're much more open to risk. And this really interestingly came out when the financial crisis happened, or even the way that India functions in terms of its economics and finances. They're not that open, because they're not that open to risk. And so these values also translate into policy. Concept of suffering and misfortune, because the individual is at the center of your iceberg. If you're unhappy, whose fault is it? It's the individual's, because the individual has the capacity to make choices, right? So if you make a bad choice, whose fault is it? It's the individual's. At least I say in arranged marriage, you can blame your parents. Come on now. Attitude towards age. This is one of the core values that we have, especially as Lutherans, and especially also in this, is the Protestant work ethic, right? The good Protestant work ethic. And so there's a lot of emphasis on doing, especially when we're thinking about mission. We think a lot about doing, and we see that. And part of the accompaniment conversation is trying to shift our sense of doing things to being in relationship. And a cultural shift that has to go alongside with that is to shift that we see sometimes relationship as passive. we sometimes see relationship as passive and not active. And so one of the shifts that we need to make as a community of faith is to see relationship at the center. And then doing is part of that relationship. And then how that relates to age is very interesting. And I place before you to think about this is that I think when it gets associated with youth or generations, I think then the perception is that your productivity decreases as you grow older. And maybe we're treating different generations according to this perception. Maybe it's something that we should take a look at. Americans don't leave much up to destiny. For example, in India, this is something that we battle through a lot of times, is that people consider that the fate is written on their foreheads. And so, if something goes wrong, they'll say instead of blaming themselves, they blame their fate. And so that's a different way of viewing life or valuing something different. Can you play the video? Did you see the tagline at the end of that commercial? What did it say? Get used to choice. So this is what's happening in the Indian culture. You know, there's another iceberg that comes and stands in front of our iceberg and said, hey, maybe you should consider the concept of choice, individual choice. Maybe this is something that you as a culture can listen to. Maybe you shouldn't throw the individual under the bus that much. What happens to you when another culture comes and stands in front of you? What are you doing? How do you respond? Do you see it as a threat to your norm? Or do you see it as a window to another experience or a mirror to yours? What do you do? I think one of the other values that we see in this culture is sort of the either-or thinking. Either or. You're either this or you're either that. And I think in our Lutheran tradition, it's always been about paradox. It's always been holding these two together, these two sides together. And in the creation story, you can see it as like God created light and darkness and they were separated. But there is also a bonding in the story of creation. That day and night come together. They are two sides of things. As we understand mission as reconciliation and restoration, we also are confronted with that sin is sort of trying to separate yourself from relationships, from God, from one another, from creation. In my journey, in my faith, I've started to recognize that departure, and Pastor Vasquez talked about this, departure and belonging is part of Christian identity. And as I have done some deep diving into my culture, and I have the privilege of exploring your culture with you, I know that I have my foot in my culture, but my other foot is always going out. I understand where I'm coming from, but that I know that I'm invited into other dimensions of being and seeing and loving and learning about God. And I have to say, in this journey, that my allegiance is not to my culture. It's to God, who is the God of all cultures. And there is evil in my culture. There is good, there's beauty. But there is evil in our culture here. There is good and there's beauty. And we are formed by it, we are rooted in it. We know things and love things with the glasses that we wear. But our call is to depart. Our call is to depart and to belong to a God that loves diversity and that has created diversity. In Ephesians, we look at that line, we're taught that reconciliation happens because Christ has taken care of that dividing line, right, between my story and your story. Christ has taken care of that dividing line. No matter what that dividing line is, that Christ has taken care of it. And before, I used to misunderstand what that used to mean. I used to think that, that line is taken away and I am and you are the same. But then, as I was reading and learning about this, I learned that the enmity has been taken away, not necessarily the difference. And the body of Christ came alive to me because the body of Christ, if you look at the body, it's not the same. The ear is not same from the eye, the mouth. And in Christ, that difference is able to be held. It takes care of the difference, but it takes care of the enmity that lies between us, but not the difference. And so here are my ending thoughts to this, and I'll come back into the church-wide report for you. As I walked in my life, I've tried to move away from being centered in self-justification, saying I have it right, the way that I can do life and see life and be in life right, and hand it to God and be grounded in God's justification for me, that I don't have to worry about myself. I don't have to do the navel gazing to be curved in on myself. I don't have to do that. I can rest in God's justification. And that diversity is an asset. And I would like to ask you about that. Think about it. Think about how you view diversity. Do you view diversity as a liability or an asset? And there can be various competencies that I can teach you about this, but without empathy, without the ability to listen to one another's stories and to imagine maybe what it would like to be walking in your shoes or in my shoes, that we have a sense of empathy that would be the beginning of our journey in accompaniment. And sometimes I can't hold your story, and maybe you can't hold my story in its fullness, but I have the confidence that God can. And so if you can repeat after me one more time. Namaste. Namaste. And the way that this greeting is translated in India is that it means when my soul meets your soul, I greet the God within you. And how I understand this greeting is that when my soul meets your soul, I greet the Christ within you. Namaste. When my iceberg is surely going to clash with your iceberg, I will greet the Christ within you. Namaste.